In 1891, a legendary French artist embarked on a journey that took him halfway around the world. His destination, the tropical paradise of the South Pacific. That September, Paul Gauguin arrived on the island of Tahiti in search of a simple, primitive life. Disappointment lay in store, as the European culture that he'd left behind had already influenced the traditional ways of the South Sea people. But the exotic location of Tahiti inspired Gauguin to produce a remarkable series of paintings. Gauguin remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of art. It took years for his artistic destiny to be revealed. Well into his 30s, he was still working as a wealthy broker at the Paris Stock Exchange. But when he decided to become an artist, he committed himself 100%. He left his family, suffered poverty and sickness, attempted to commit suicide, and died prematurely on an isolated Pacific island. But the revolutionary images he created had a massive influence on the artists of the 20th century and beyond.
Paul Gauguin is one of those major figures of the late 19th century. Who's seen now as the foundations of modern art.
I think it was his development of his interest in primitive art forms and primitive people that actually opened the way for increased development of this idea in the 20th century.
Eugene Henri Paul Gauguin was born in Paris on June 7th, 1848. His father was a radical journalist at this time, and revolution was in the air. But by the end of 1848, the forces of French conservatism prevailed, so the Gauguin family decided to leave France for their own safety. In early 1849, they traveled to Peru, South America, and remained there until 1855. Many students of Gauguin see this early exile as the source of a lifelong taste for the exotic. Later in his life, Gauguin recalled his Peruvian boyhood with affection. He certainly preferred his South American years to the school days that followed back in France. And when the opportunity came to leave school and join the French Merchant Navy, he seized it. From 17 until 23, Paul Gauguin enjoyed life on the ocean wave. During this period, his mother died, and the stockbroker Gustave Arosa was appointed as his official guardian. In 1871, it was Arosa who secured Gauguin a job as a broker in the Parisian Stock Exchange. Before long, the young man was earning good money, but he also took up a new hobby outside of his working hours: art. It is believed that Gauguin's first coherent attempts at painting date from 1873, when he was 25 years old. His guardian was an art lover whose collection included works by the French masters Delacroix, Courbet, and Corot. We can detect the influence of Corot in this early Gauguin landscape, a canvas that reveals a striking degree of competence for a part-time artist. Art was still just a hobby for the creator of this calm, unassuming image. In the years that followed, everyday responsibilities occupied most of Gauguin's time. At the end of 1873, he married a Danish woman, Mette Gad, and the couple had 5 children. By the end of the decade, Paul Gauguin was the head of a wealthy Parisian family. Gauguin also built up a substantial art collection, but his taste was more contemporary than that of his guardian. In the late 1870s, he bought works by Monet, Renoir, Degas, and the other artists who became known as the Impressionists. And he had special regard for an Impressionist artist who became an associate, a friend, and a strong influence upon his own work. Camille Pissarro.
Pissarro was enormously important to Gauguin. He took him under his wing, as he did so many young artists, of course, and invited Gauguin to come and paint with him in 79, 81, and after that as well. And he encouraged Gauguin to become interested in and start painting in the Impressionist way, lightening his palettes, more brushstrokes, and so on.
It was much more, I think, Camille Pissarro's attitude, taking the contemporary and the urban contemporary, for that matter, which was important, and encouraging, not encouraging to paint like Pissarro or to paint like anybody else, but to paint like what he was capable of doing himself, in other words, to be Gauguin.
Pissarro's influence can be seen in this Gauguin landscape from 1879, entitled The Market Gardens at Vaugirard. We can immediately see that this is a more animated image than his earlier Corot-influenced work. The palette is bolder and more impressionist, though we are still a long way from the revolutionary colours of the artist's later works. By the time this canvas was completed, the stockbroker was becoming well known as an artist. Through the influence of Pissarro, he began to exhibit his work at the famous Impressionist exhibitions. And it was Pissarro who introduced Gauguin to another inspirational figure. In the summer of 1881, Gauguin painted alongside Pissarro and another exhibitor at the Impressionist shows. But this artist was already going beyond Impressionism. Gauguin was so impressed that he jokingly suggested drugging him to make him reveal the secrets of his genius. The artist in question was Paul Cézanne.
What Gauguin liked about Cézanne's work was his structured brushstroke and his formal approach to painting.
In terms of colour, I don't think that we can see Cézanne as in any way influencing Gauguin, or indeed vice versa. I think it is in this area of the painting taking off from the original concern in different ways, but with Cézanne also the concern with what we would now regard as flat surface, multiple vision. Not what Gauguin did, but it was the fact that it encouraged him, I think, to be concerned with non-modelling, to put it very crudely, that is, of flat surface, flat areas of colour.
By 1882, Cézanne's work took pride of place in Gauguin's collection of art. But the amateur painter now had to consider his future. He told Pissarro that he wanted to paint for a living, and when the Paris stock market crashed, Gauguin made the fateful decision to devote himself to art. He began his professional career with canvases such as Entrance to a Village, but pictures like this failed to find buyers, and before long, the artist's money began to run out. In August 1884, the frustrated Madame Gauguin decided to return to her own family in Copenhagen. By the end of the year, her struggling husband had joined her. Gauguin's troubles were now beginning. In the Danish capital, he took a mundane job with a tarpaulin company, but he was soon frustrated with his work, his wife's family, and Danish society in general. By June 1885, he was back in Paris with one of his sons, having left the rest of his family behind. The winter that followed was the worst of his life. Just 2 years previously, Gauguin had enjoyed a high standard of living in a fine Parisian home. Now, he was reduced to miserable rented accommodation as he worked as a bill poster to pay for treatment for his sick son. He also began to sell off his art collection, but with one strict condition. His beloved Cézannes were not to be sold. By 1886, Paul Gauguin's art had taken over his life, and he rarely saw his family again. In the spring, he exhibited at the 8th Impressionist exhibition. It was also the last. Artists like Monet and Renoir were already going their own way, and at the 1886 exhibition, it was the neo-impressionism pioneered by Georges Seurat that proved the biggest talking point. It wasn't only in painting that new artistic thinking found expression. In literature, a group of writers, led by Albert Oriot, argued that art of any sort should not have to reflect the physical external reality of things. In a popular phrase of the time, they were anti-naturalist. Instead, they saw art as the imaginative vision of the artist, whatever the result of that might be. This was the birth of symbolism, and when the symbolist movement expanded into visual art, it was the work of Paul Gauguin that was celebrated the most.
Symbolism was the movement in the 1890s that was completely opposed to Impressionism and also somewhat to the academic art of the time, although it was part of the academic art. There was Moreau, Redon, and they used their imagination. They didn't want to go and sit in front of a motif. They wanted to look inside to see what was there, especially Redon, of course. And Gauguin became interested in the meanings of paintings from about the 80s on because he was interested in theory and religion and also in folk art and primitive art. And in primitive art, for Western people at least, there was a lot of hidden symbolism because it was so strange and not in any way connected with their own culture.
In the latter half of the 1880s, Gauguin's art took on the characteristics that appealed to symbolist writers like Albert Oriot. It was a remarkable artistic evolution. In the summer of 1886, Gauguin decided to leave Paris to seek out a more simple, primitive way of life. His destination was the town of Port-Aven in Brittany. The Breton culture was less sophisticated than that of the French capital.
Now, Brittany was not all that far from Paris, really, and yet it was another world. And because of that, because of its own customs, remember it's basically Celtic, rather more like Cornwall and Wales and the rest of France. And because it retained its customs and yet was within striking distance of Paris, it became an attraction for intellectuals, writers and painters and others, to settle there. But it was the freedom that appealed to Gauguin. And of course, he was still within striking distance of home, so to speak. So in a sense, there was a safety net there. But it did inspire him.
But Gauguin wanted more. In a letter to his estranged wife, he revealed his desire to live as a savage. So in April 1887, he left Europe altogether, travelling first to Panama, then to the Caribbean island of Martinique. He did indeed live as a savage in a tiny native hut. But there was nothing unsophisticated about the paintings he created. Images like this Martinique landscape reveal an artist approaching his creative maturity.
In Martinique, Gauguin began using brighter colours and lighter colours because he enjoyed the light in Martinique. And he also used a much looser, more delicate brushstroke, possibly deriving from some of Cézanne's work of the 70s. And he formalised his paintings slightly differently in areas of colour, not solid colour, broken colour. But there was a decorative effect that he managed to achieve in these works, which carried on into his later work.
Once having made the move away from Paris, he'd moved to Martinique, still a French territory there, so it was still, in other words, French. So it was, again, a bit of a safety net. But it did introduce him, he realised, that of a society which was totally different from Western European society, whose beliefs and therefore whose actions, customs, quite apart from the landscape itself and the people themselves. And so this, I think, was I'm pretty certain, was the sort of the final point at which he mentally broke from Western Europe.
Gauguin was becoming less concerned with depicting external reality. Here, we can appreciate a far more personal interpretation of the landscape, with form and colour subordinate to the artist's mood. Gauguin's Martinique experience was crucial for his development as an artist. But it was back in France in the year 1888 that his genius really emerged. From February until October, Gauguin remained in Brittany, painting canvases like this simple peasant scene. But in August 1888, he was joined by a fellow artist who would exert a profound influence on his work. His name was Émile Bernard, a 20-year-old who shared Gauguin's admiration for Cézanne. Bernard was also an enthusiast of the Japanese prints popular at the time, and he sought a similar simplification of line and colour in his paintings. In this Bernard canvas from early 1888, we see large areas of flat, unbroken colour, surrounded by bold outlines, a technique that became known as cloisonnism.
Cloisonnism was a movement sort of invented by Émile Bernard, and it was when you enclosed areas of fairly solid colour in black outlines. It goes back to primitive art and naive art, in fact. And it has a decorative effect, if that's what you want it to have. And Gauguin was interested in the decorative effect, the formal qualities that this could bring to the surface of the canvas. It wasn't a way of painting where you had shadows or depth particularly. It was a little bit like Art Nouveau in the fact that it wanted some decorative effect on the onlooker.
Émile Bernard canvases such as this proved vital for the art of his friend Gauguin. We can see this as an early symbolist image, but it was Gauguin who came to be seen as the founder of the symbolist school. The main reason was this impressive canvas completed in autumn 1888. This is The Vision After the Sermon, a painting very different to the peasant scene created just a few months earlier. It is still nominally a scene of Breton life. A group of peasant women have just listened to a sermon describing the biblical story of Jacob wrestling with an angel, and they imagine that the scene is being played out before them. Here we see the symbolist approach in its strictest sense. The women are visualizing a fight, so the artist covers the canvas with a bloody vermilion to express the idea. This suggestive use of colour is a key feature of Gauguin's mature work. Around the time he completed this dynamic image, he expressed his artistic thinking in simple terms. Ideas dominate technique. With this great canvas, he put his theory into practice.
Vision After the Sermon is one of the works which was produced as a result of his sojourn in Brittany, picking up on the native customs, dress customs, bringing in this area of flat colour. It also shows, again, with Gauguin, what was to be very important, that is, it's the ideas, as with symbolism, the ideas which are conveyed. In other words, the work takes off, in a sense. And this is a manipulation of colour, of form, of the external subject matter, composition, because of the conveying of ideas. On the right-hand side is the figure that appears to be of a local minister or something. And it seems reasonable to assume that there was a sermon that day at the morning service, and they'd gone in their Sunday best, the people of the village. And this was, again, rather like Rousseau's dream, that this is the ideas which were in the heads of the people who had listened to that sermon.
The vision after the sermon was Gauguin's first masterpiece, and it came to be seen as the very birth of symbolist painting. But at the time of its creation, the artist was still struggling with poverty. So, when a Parisian art dealer offered him the chance of a regular monthly income, he welcomed it. There were two conditions for this arrangement. Firstly, Gauguin had to paint this enigmatic self-portrait. Secondly, he had to move to the south of France to stay with the dealer's artist brother. And so, in October 1888, Gauguin arrived in the Provençal city of Arles to join Vincent van Gogh. The Dutch artist's intention was to form an artist's colony, and Gauguin was to be his first fellow colonist. It was a bold idea, but the result was a disaster.
Van Gogh was really intense, and this had built up into a thing where he felt that he would wish to start a colony of artists, intellectual artists, but with Gauguin as their master, their supreme head. And he set about doing it, I mean, just as he thought he did. So he started it. He started decorating rooms and getting furniture for Gauguin and so forth. And then persuaded him to come down. A bit reluctantly, one thinks, really, but nevertheless Gauguin did. But it didn't last long. He couldn't put up with the intensity, I think, of Vincent.
At first, the concept of the artist's colony appeared to bear fruit. Both painters were interested in the suggestive power of colour. With his famous Night Café, Van Gogh sought to convey a sense of darkness and foreboding by his intense use of red and green. By comparison, Gauguin's own version of the same scene appears less revolutionary. But his work in Provence did reveal the bold innovations that he had taken up in Brittany. With this portrait of Van Gogh painting sunflowers, we see a highly simplified colour scheme in a flat, almost claustrophobic image that may reflect the troubled relationship between artist and subject. In December 1888, Gauguin and Van Gogh came to blows. On the very day this canvas was completed, a fierce argument took place and Vincent attacked his friend with a razor. With good reason, Gauguin fled. Shortly afterwards, he discovered that Van Gogh had cut off his own ear.
There are different versions of this. The one we tend to rely on is Gauguin's version, but it was after the event, and it's possible that he was justifying himself. He said that Van Gogh attacked him, but it's not quite clear whether this was actually the case or not. But Van Gogh was certainly feeling destabilised because Gauguin had said that he was going to leave. But then Van Gogh cut his ear off, and this is what really made Gauguin leave. He felt he couldn't be with a madman any longer.
Van Gogh's self-mutilation marked the end of his dreams of an artist's colony as Gauguin returned to Paris in haste. Just days before, Van Gogh and Gauguin had visited the town of Montpellier to admire the works of Courbet on show there. Gauguin especially admired the well-known Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet, a painting that inspired his own very different Bonjour, Monsieur Gauguin, early in 1889. Gauguin could have intended to convey an idea of loneliness with this sombre image. He was still an obscure figure at the time and living in poverty, a situation which an 1889 exhibition of his work did nothing to change. This was the so-called Volpini exhibition, an unofficial event for radical artists like Gauguin, Bernard and Emile Schufenecker, an old friend from the stockbrokers who had also turned to painting. The Volpini show was prompted by the World's Fair, the great Paris exposition whose legacy lives on in the shape of the Eiffel Tower. Gauguin must have hoped to find buyers amongst the millions of visitors who attended the fair. But his hopes were in vain. None of his 17 exhibited works were sold. But the World's Fair event did have its compensations. The critic, Albert Aurier, wrote a favourable article about the Volpini exhibition, and the fair itself proved inspirational for Gauguin. He loved the many reconstructions of exotic, faraway places. He was also interested in the many exhibited examples of native art. Gauguin was fascinated by so-called primitive art. His admiration for Japanese prints was typical of the time. But his enthusiasm for non-European art was stronger than most. In 1888, he created this woodcut, whose title translates as "Be in love and you will be happy." Here, Gauguin has incorporated the figure of a Peruvian mummy. This was a bold move, preempting a fascination with native art that influenced many great artists in the decades that followed.
That was part and parcel of the great movement of other influences coming in, which encouraged people like Picasso, for instance. Picasso had in his studio a number of masks from different carved masks and artifacts from different parts of non-European cultures, and similarly other artists as well. So it's really sort of, he physically was there as part of it. He tried to become absorbed with it, to Gauguin, become part of it. He never became part of it. He was always regarded as an outsider, I feel.
Gauguin's enthusiasm for native art began when he was working at Le Poldou in Brittany, and he became interested in the stone figures of Christ that were dotted around the countryside in little shrines, and this led him into appreciating other primitive forms of art, oceanic art, of course, eventually. And this influenced his work because he incorporated these figures into his paintings.
The native art on show at the World's Fair prompted Gauguin to leave Europe altogether to pursue his own primitive art away from the distractions of modern life. This voyage would eventually lead him to the islands of the South Pacific. But in the summers of 1889 and 1890, he again had to content himself with Brittany. From there, he wrote of himself as being a savage, intent on returning to the wilderness. Increasingly, primitive elements now featured in his art. We can see this clearly in the Breton Calvary, or Green Christ, from 1889. With this canvas, Gauguin once again attempted to communicate an idea, in this case, the simple Breton faith. His adaptation of traditional local monuments contributes to the powerful simplicity of the effect. But with this religious image, also from 1889, the spirituality is almost overwhelming. This is the Yellow Christ, a canvas that more than any other demonstrates how form, and especially colour, are subordinate to the idea.
This is conveying an idea through a manipulation of colour and using a positive symbol. It becomes therefore a powerful symbolic message about the risen Christ, about a tenet, a doctrine of the Catholic Church, which went so much to the people with whom he was living at that time.
By the time this famous picture was completed, Gauguin's aesthetic philosophy had fully evolved, and the 41-year-old painter now had a number of younger admirers. Amongst them was Paul Seruzier, the painter of this astonishing 1888 canvas, The Talisman. This small painting was directly inspired by Gauguin's theories, and one quote attributed to Gauguin reveals the boldness of his artistic vision. It is said that he told Seruzier, "How do you see this tree? Is it really green? Use green then, the most beautiful green on your palette. And that shadow, rather blue? Don't be afraid to paint it as blue as possible." For students of 20th century art, this kind of approach to painting is not especially unusual. But in the late 1880s, this was radical thinking. Many have argued that Gauguin was the first true modern artist. In conversation with his friend Emil Schufenecker, Gauguin offered some advice. Don't paint too much from nature. Art is an abstraction.
Gauguin, we see his concern with colour as being the dominant factor in composition, leading directly to people like Matisse and Derain. And that's only a few years later. We call them the Fauvists. That's because that was a name which was given to my critics because of their wild use of colour. And that then launched Gauguin through Matisse and Derain into the 20th century.
Gauguin's a modern 20th century artist in as much as he was interested in the imagination and in different cultures as well, and in his willingness to depict dreams or imaginary situations, or at least to interpret what he saw in an imaginary kind of way, rather than just putting down what was in front of his nose. He invested his paintings with a lot of imagination, a lot of emotion and feeling.
Gauguin's influence on 20th century art may have been rivaled only by that of his old hero, Paul Cézanne. Gauguin himself never lost his own admiration for Cézanne's work. It is said that he would shout, "Let's do a Cézanne," before settling down at his easel. We can see Gauguin's respect for his fellow artist in this 1890 Portrait of a Woman with Still Life by Cézanne. At the time, Cézanne was still an obscure figure, living a life of self-imposed isolation in his native Provence. Shortly afterwards, his great admirer also decided to withdraw from the mainstream world. Gauguin certainly possessed a lifelong fascination with exotic, distant lands. He made up his mind to leave France forever and travel to an island in the South Pacific Ocean, Tahiti.
We do know that there was this background, his Peruvian background, his increasing being disconcerted by the contemporary society in which he lived, the breakup of his marriage to his very respectable Danish wife, who was in effect abandoned. She went off to home with most of the children, apart from one son, then he went. He was therefore cut off. He'd given up his job, he'd lost his wife and family. The attractions of going abroad again, after the Martinique experience, must have been quite attractive.
His attitude towards Tahitians was actually very typical of his time. In other words, it was fairly racist. I think he saw them as simple people, and perhaps he thought this would suit him better than the difficulties of living in a society where nobody appreciated him at all or seemed not to appreciate him.
By early 1891, Gauguin was ready to make his 10,000-mile voyage to the South Seas. He was leaving on a high note. Prior to his departure, he sold 30 paintings for the impressive sum of 10,000 francs. He was also praised as the founder of symbolism in an important article by Albert Auria, and on March the 23rd, he was honoured with a banquet at the Café Voltaire in Paris. A week later, he boarded a ship in the port of Marseille and left France for the Paradise Islands of the South Pacific. It is for this amazing relocation that Gauguin may be best known today. In June 1891, he arrived at Tahiti, arranged accommodation in a simple plank house, and began to paint the tropical scenes that surrounded him. This Tahitian landscape dates from the artist's early weeks on the island, and its bright, almost decorative colour can be seen as conveying the simple idea of the exotic. It's also easy to consider this to be an image of paradise. We can see this in Gauguin's early paintings of the Tahitian population, especially the island's women. One of the reasons that Gauguin chose Tahiti was his belief that the local women were unusually free with their affections. Before long, his opinion was to be confirmed. Shortly after his arrival on the island, Gauguin married a local girl called Tehamana. She was just 13 years old. Despite this, Tahiti was not the real paradise that Gauguin had hoped for. A century of European intervention had all but destroyed the old native way of life. The Western clothes of the Tahitian girl in this 1891 portrait give an indication of this, as do Gauguin's many paintings of Christianity as practiced by the native population. One canvas depicts two young women performing the Hail Mary, and their faith is rewarded by a vision of the Madonna and Child, just as the Breton peasant women experienced their vision of Jacob in the artist's first masterpiece. Christianity had made a deep impact on Tahitian life, but traditional beliefs did live on. In this memorable picture, Gauguin depicted a conversation between the Tahitian moon goddess Hina and the earth spirit Fatu. Gauguin may have exaggerated the survival of old Tahitian beliefs in order to boost his own image as the ultimate primitive artist. But we know that the inspiration for this canvas was entirely authentic. This is an image of Gauguin's young wife, Timahana, receiving a visitation from a ghostly figure to the left. Like many other Tahitians, Timahana believed that ghosts came into houses at night, and Gauguin described how he came home one night to find her lying on her bed, shaking with fear. With this highly symbolist canvas, Gauguin fully captured her experience of terror.
Gauguin thought that in this painting he was really investigating certain aspects of Tahitian culture, the more magical aspects of it. And he was very pleased with the painting because of that. He said that the position of the woman could have been vaguely indecent, but it's not, in fact, because she's sleeping and she's very rigid with fear.
Although Gauguin created images inspired by actual events, he was also prepared to use his imagination in his Tahitian work. This canvas, The Day of God, supposedly depicts a traditional form of worship. But no idols of this nature were ever created in Tahiti. Gauguin borrowed the form of this figure from an Indian source, and it was not the only occasion when he turned to his collection of drawings and prints for his subject matter. This 1894 painting was not even painted in Tahiti. 2 years after arriving on the island, Gauguin had grown frustrated with Pacific life. He was ill with syphilis. He received little in the way of money from Paris, and there were few portrait commissions from the island's European settlers. In June 1893, in desperation, he headed back to France. This may have been an embarrassment for a man who had vowed never to return. But his reacquaintance with civilization only added to his legend. While in Paris, he found himself another exotic young partner, a Sinhalese girl known as Anna the Javanese. In early 1894, she accompanied Gauguin to Brittany, where the artist returned to the Breton peasantry as subject matter for his work. But Gauguin was never able to resettle in France. In May 1894, he was injured in a fight with a group of sailors near Pont-Aven, and his new girlfriend ran off shortly afterwards. Before long, he again felt the call of the Pacific. In early 1895, he sold more of his work to raise money for a return to Tahiti. This time, the sale was a failure, but an article published by Gauguin to promote the event was nonetheless revealing. In response to a critical review of his work, he referred to a conflict between the establishment civilization and himself, the barbarian. The idea of Gauguin as barbarian is an enduring feature of his legend. The extent to which it was actually true is still discussed today.
The criticism of the late 19th century artists, particularly people like the Post Impressionists and so forth, was often pretty virulent, sometimes crude, and names are stuck sometimes. There was a period, and certainly at the time, when what Gauguin was doing was regarded as barbaric, and therefore he was, I think, believed, actually called a barbarian. It's a difficult word to understand what it means, because at the time it would have meant the fact that it was going against all that was civilized, and therefore it was barbaric in that sense. I really can't understand the use of that word subsequently. It seems to be meaningless now. It's a historic fact that it was used about him and his work, but nowadays I just don't think that it's a relevant word to use.
I wouldn't like to use the word barbarian at all, for anyone in fact, unless they were completely mad. I don't think Gauguin was completely mad. I think he had problems reconciling his French upbringing with his Spanish inheritance, if you like, which is partly why he was interested in going back to his Spanish roots, if you like, in these primitive works of art, and exploring a more romantic part of himself than the French would allow, something much more basic than French culture.
Whatever our views on the supposedly uncivilized figure of Gauguin, his second trip to Tahiti marked a final severance from Western society. On June the 29th, 1895, he left Paris for the last time. He would never return to France. Two months later, he arrived back on Tahiti. Before long, he'd found himself another teenage girlfriend and returned to his paintings of island scenes. Again, it was Christianity that provided much of his subject matter. The Tahitian title of this 1896 canvas is Te Tamari no Atus. The English title is The Birth of Christ, the Son of God. Another picture of spiritual vision, in this case, the infant Christ himself. This is a powerful image of faith, but many viewers are also struck by the mood of darkness that permeates the picture. Some have suggested that Gauguin may have been affected by the death of a daughter born to his young partner. If so, it was one of the many difficulties that he faced at that time. By the end of 1897, Gauguin's life was falling apart. His syphilis was now serious enough to prevent him from working for long periods, and it appears that he suffered a number of heart attacks. He was still stricken by poverty and was often forced to paint on unprimed sackcloth instead of canvas. This self-portrait provides an insight into the artist's suffering. Shortly after creating this gloomy image, Gauguin decided to end his own life. But before committing suicide, he decided to create a final masterpiece, a vast canvas that would bring together all his ideas and beliefs. It remains one of the towering achievements of late 19th century art. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going?
Where Do We Come From is one of his largest paintings, about 12 by 4. And it's supposed to sum up his views of Tahitian culture, especially in its more mysterious spiritual aspects. And it is a very interesting work of art from this point of view. It's also interesting formally. It's also interesting because of what it shows us about Tahitian life at that time.
The immediate reason for the painting was the death of one of his daughters, his favourite daughter, in fact. And therefore, to ask the question, what is the meaning of life? Yes, that occurs to all of us at times, right there. And I think that he slipped, if you like, not slipped, or used a traditional Christian imagery and symbolism of nativity, birth, of growth and life, to to the crucifixion. The figure in the middle seems to be very much like a figure of crucifixion. And then to the empty tomb, or death and resurrection of Christ on the left-hand side. There's also another one which occurs to me as I look at that, is that the figure in the middle is plucking an apple, which again could refer back to the Old Testament, to the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and the disaster when they picked the apple, which could also be intricately bound up with that same narrative.
Shortly after creating this work of art in December 1897, Gauguin prepared to commit suicide. Arsenic poisoning was the method he chose, but the attempt failed. He swallowed too much chemical and his stomach rejected the poison. So Gauguin lived on, and he was soon able to return to his painting. This 1898 White Horse reveals a symbolist artist still at the peak of his powers. But the end was now approaching. In 1900, Gauguin's illness prevented him from painting at all, and the following year he left Tahiti for the Marquesas Islands, 800 miles away. It was there, in early 1903, that he painted this final self-portrait. Gauguin died a few months later on May the 8th. In the course of his 54 years, Gauguin had travelled the world for the sake of his art. And it's appropriate that his life should end half a world away from the society he professed to despise. But his achievement as an artist ultimately came from within. The genius of Gauguin was to liberate the painter from the old ways of naturalism, to make the artist's idea central to his art. Perhaps more than any other 19th century artist, it was Paul Gauguin who pointed the way for the generations that followed.